is Dr. Grace Chen. I'm a licensed emergency and family therapist, EMDRIA-approved consultant, and EMDR-certified clinician. I'm based in Andover, Massachusetts, and my clinical work primarily involves working with adults individually or as a couple, integrating EMDR with attachment theory and polyvagal theory. In the previous video, I review and give 4 to 5 minute summary of each article featured in the Go With That magazine, spring 2026. And that takes longer than I expected. All review, just 5 articles, takes about 30 minutes. So to avoid overwhelming you, I decided to cut this topic into 2 videos. And in today's video, I will provide an overview of a very important person's research and contribution to preparing clients with complex trauma for EMDR processing. And I will also summarize the themes from these articles, including from the Go With That magazine, as well as the two articles I'm going to review, and then see how it stacks up with the New Haven trauma treatment standard. So let's get started and dive in. So all of the articles from the Go With That magazine are very helpful in understanding all of those authors' clinical work with the clients, children, adolescents, adults with complex PTSD. I learned so much from them, and in the back of my head was now so many analogies to think about working with clients with complex PTSD and EMDR. The most important thing is the importance of stabilization, resourcing, using 5 Ps to evaluate. All those sort of things are so much helpful. As that being said, while I was reading it, I cannot help but to think about a very important person's work. That is Dr. Deborah Korn's work. Her work with Dr. Andrew Lee, we all learned that in our EMDR basic training, that is Resource Development Installation, or RDI. So in the next 3 slides, I'm going to summarize 2 articles from Dr. Korn, from her articles in 2002 and 2009. Even though it was at least 8 years ago when I was a new EMDR learner sitting at Dr. Korn's little office in Cambridge with 5 other consultees, I remember it was like 3 years going in almost every other week in the fall and in the spring. And my head is often, when I start seeing a new client, I often have her voices in my head, and it's kind of like my adaptive memory network emphasizing the importance. These 2 words is always in my head. That's called front loading the resources. She emphasized to front loading the resources to help the client with complex trauma so that we wouldn't re-traumatize the clients with the trauma memory. We allow resources for them to self-regulate. So when I was reading the magazines this time, I knew that I absolutely had to include her articles in this video. In these 2 articles, Dr. Korn pointed out that complex PTSD often arises from chronic childhood abuse and severe developmental neglect. And because these survivors experience profound deficit in affect regulation, impulse control, and self-identity. So if we're pushing them into standard trauma processing too quickly, can easily overwhelm them and lead to high dropout rates and even re-traumatization. So according to Dr. Korn, to treat this vulnerable population safely, clinicians has to embrace a phase-oriented, multi-model, and titrated approach. First, treatment must prioritize stabilization through resource development installation, or RDI. Instead of jumping into traumatic memories, clinicians use RDI to pair positive imagery, such as mastery experiences or safe metaphors, with very short sets of bilateral stimulation, typically just 6 to 12 back and forth passes. These shorter sets are a vital safety measure, preventing the brain from accidentally associating back into traumatic memory networks while the client builds emotional tolerance. Second, in Dr. Korn's research, a fascinating outcome of prioritizing this stabilization phase is that severe dysregulation often improves before trauma symptoms do. By using RDI to establish positive psychological resources, clients can interrupt their destructive behavioral chains such as self-injury, binge eating, and dissociation. And this will increase self-efficacy, ultimately make the client stable enough to eventually tolerate standard trauma processing. Third, when the client is finally ready to processing trauma memories, clinicians must alter their target selection. Instead of immediately targeting the earliest or worst childhood memories, EMDR therapists often use a symptom-focused approach by targeting recent adult trauma or present-day triggers. Clients can often successfully extinguish their current PTSD symptoms without even needing to direct face their overwhelming childhood memories, unless those memories spontaneously arise and can be safely tolerated. Fourth, during the trauma processing, the therapist must act as an active psychobiological regulator. The clinician cannot be passive. They must actively keep the client within their window of tolerance. If a client experiences looping or dissociation, the therapist can use cognitive interweaved, centered on safety, responsibility, and choice. If the client becomes flooded, the therapist employs advanced titration strategies, such as asking the client to process only 5 drops of the emotions or using a visual remote control to pause the memory. Finally, when adapted in this way, EMDR often offer a very unique advantages over traditional prolonged exposure therapy. Most notably, it results in much lower dropout rates because traumatic exposure happens in short, controlled bursts, and it gives the client greater control over the passing. In addition, EMDR allow clients to process their trauma without needing to provide a detailed verbal recounting of the events. And this is a crucial benefit for healing the chronic neglect, profound attachment failure, and acts of omission that drives complex trauma, which are notoriously difficult for survivors to put into words. So how do you create a resource development installation? RDI exclusively targets and strengthens passive functional memory network and self-capacities. It explicitly avoids stimulating dysfunctional or traumatic materials. The protocol utilizes brief set of bilateral stimulation, just 6 to 12 passes, and this will allow the client to safely install resources without triggering a dissociative or flooded trauma response. Resources are highly tailored to the client and then can include like a mastery experiences, meaning the successful experiences, the ability they are able to master in the past, relational role models, or symbolic metaphors. These are ultimately integrated into a future template to help the client imaginary rehearse for upcoming life challenges. RDI acts as the essential prerequisite for trauma processing. It reliably reduces severe post-traumatic dysregulation, such as self-harm or dissociation, and giving the client the emotional tolerance they need to finally heal their deepest wound. So I have introduced 2 additional articles from Dr. Korn and the 5 articles from the Go With Them magazine. So what are the common themes that come up from all these 7 articles? So across all of these articles, 5 from the Go With Them magazine and 2 from Dr. Korn's RDI, we know that clients with complex trauma often lack self-regulation strategies because of the chronic neglect and the abuse experiences and profound childhood lack of attachment or nurturing experiences. So without teaching the client self-regulation strategies before activating the trauma memory, we are running the risk of re-traumatizing the client. Therefore, incorporating EMDR standard protocol when treating clients with complex PTSD, we need to modify to fit with the client's needs. The very first theme from all these 7 articles is that we need to reconceptualize phase 1 in complex trauma. Phase 1, the history taking cannot be treated as a quick preliminary step. It must serve as a comprehensive clinical foundation, and clinicians must map out a highly disorganized system, focusing not only on the overt abuse that occurred, but on the developmental neglect or what didn't happen, such as lack of safety or emotional mirroring. To translate these chaotic relational patterns into a safe treatment sequence, therapists organize clinical data, such as we can use the 5Ps framework, presenting, precipitating, predisposing, perpetuating, and protective factors. And this can ensure that pacing decisions are anchored in structured data rather than moving too quickly into trauma processing. The second theme is the absolute necessary of extended preparation phase 2. This is the most critical phase for complex trauma clients. These individuals are frequently lack the adaptive information needed to safely process horrific memories. Metaphorically, according to Thomas Zimmerman, they lack a big enough boat to land a whale of a traumatic memory. So to build this capacity, therapists must proactively develop the client's internal resources and affect tolerance using resource development installation before touching traumatic memories. Because complex clients often struggle with traditional visualization, so there are different resources being offered, such as Zimmerman's recommendation of tibial toe-in resourcing rely on highly concrete, exceptionally brief, and consent-driven coping exercise to safely build emotional tolerance. The third theme is the altering target selection from standard EMDR training. So the standard EMDR training often teaches a clinician to target the first and the worst memory, but doing this with complex trauma survivor set them up for failure and potential flooding. So instead, the therapist must alter their target selection to work at the edge of what is both tolerable and productive for the client's nervous system. If narrative memories are overwhelming or inaccessible, the therapist can use a bottom-up and symptom-focused approach, safely entering the memory network through present-day triggers, physical symptoms, or somatic sensations, rather than forcing the client to face their early childhood wound immediately. The fourth theme is EMDR must directly address somatic and ego fragmentation. Chronic trauma forces the nervous system to adapt through dissociation, fragmenting the client's identity and disconnecting them from their physical body. This manifests as either somatoform dissociation, that is, the body expresses trauma through physical pain and illness, or somatic dissociation, that is, the client feels their body is distant or not mine. EMDR must focus heavily on restoring interoceptive awareness before processing. And even more, trauma splinters the ego into distinctive self states or protective parts. Therapists must assess these parts and foster internal cooperation rather than treating the client's nervous system as a single unified entity. The fifth theme is that the therapist must act as an active co-regulator. And the EMDR clinician cannot be a passive observer when treating complex trauma. They must act as an active co-regulator. The therapist must actively pace the session using micro-titrations, such as videotape approach, process only tiny pieces of a memory at a time to prevent the client's nervous system from flooding. The therapeutic relationship itself becomes a primary tool for healing. By using targeted cognitive interweave and identify a tipping point near the end of the session to shift from trauma revelation to structure relational repair. And then the therapist can ensure the client safely override their historical expectations of abandonment and danger. So to summarize, the healing complex trauma is a structural ascent. You first have to establish a profound safety. Adapting EMDR relies fundamentally on building a bedrock of safety before any trauma processing can occur. And you have to embrace the timeline by micro-pacing, somatic modifications, and extended preparation are clinical necessity. Don't try to rush into the reprocessing. That is one of the important mistakes that I made in my earlier EMDR days. The last is that we have to collaborate. Navigating complex trauma is not a rapid extraction, but a deeply structured, heavily supported collaboration. I came across an article titled A Consensus Statement on Trauma Mental Health, the New Haven Competency Conference Process and Major Findings. It was quite a few years ago. I came across this accidentally. I don't remember the circumstances, but I remember the impact of the article on my clinical work with trauma survivors. And then so I thought like, okay, now I have the theme of the 7 articles. How are the common themes stack up with the New Haven competency? So it helps to know where the standard actually came from. Try to think back to the early 2000s. We have 9/11, we have the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have Hurricane Katrina. And it all pushed trauma into the national spotlight. And then suddenly we had a massive influx of people needing help. But here was the problem. The science of trauma was growing fast, but formal evidence-based trauma training in graduate school was practically non-existent. So most clinicians were stepping into the room with only a cursory understanding of what they were dealing with. To fix this, in 2013, 60 of leading experts in traumatic stress gathered at Yale School of Medicine. And their goal is to figure out exactly what a clinician needs to know in order to competently treat trauma across the lifespan. There aren't meant to be rigid rules, but aspirational guidelines. And this is the gold standard we use to measure if clinician actually has the knowledge, skill, and the attitude to do this heavy work safely. So in the next few slides, I'm going to summarize the New Haven competency standards before I compare the theme to the New Haven competency. So the expert divided this requirement into 2 categories, and one is the A cross-cutting competencies and 5 broad core competencies. Cross-cutting competencies is the foundational principle that underlie all aspects of trauma work. They represent overarching values, skills, and attitudes such as prioritizing safety, honoring diversity, and practicing self-care, and that must be integrated into every single stage of trauma practice. And the broad core competencies represents the specific functional areas of clinical practice, and they are the distinct specialized tasks a clinician performs, such as conducting an assessment, delivering a psychological intervention, or navigating the legal system. So cross-cutting competencies are ubiquitous and continuous, and broad core competency are task-specific and functional. That's a difference. Okay, so the A cross-cutting competencies, these are the foundational competencies and must be applied across all domains of trauma practice. And when we look at the New Haven cross-cutting competencies, the first major pillar of the standard is that how we view the client's context. The competencies stress that understanding a client's intersecting identities, their race, gender, socioeconomic status, and cultural background is not just about building a good report. It is a fundamental part of accurately to do case conceptualization and treatment planning. So for clients with complex trauma, their environment often play a role in either perpetuating the abuse or failing to protect them. And competent trauma care means that we look at the whole person, modify our interventions to respect the specific context so that the clients live and so we can help them heal. And then so therefore we must honor the diversity by tailoring assessment and intervention to account for individual cultural, community, and organizational diversity. And then while we have to articulating our personal bias. And we also have to adjust approaches to account for developmental factors across the client's lifespan, addressing complex trauma exposure. We have to understand the complexities of trauma exposure, including long and short-term effect and the personal environmental interactions. The second crucial lens from the cross-cutting competency is a therapeutic alliance. The New Haven competency highlights our responsibility to navigate this with incredible care. A client with C-PTSD might present with intense mistrust or deep dependence that pulls at our boundaries. The standard warns us against recreating disempowering dynamics or repeating the power structure of their past abusers. This requires us to use relational healing for relational injuries. It means that we have to be highly attuned to the passing of the work and the shifting dynamics in the room. We must maintain clear, consistent boundaries while offering a profound level of safety and collaboration in the decision-making process. In complex trauma work, the way we relate to the client is part of the intervention. And we have to incorporating strengths and shared decision-making. Incorporating a survivor's resilience and the potential for growth while actively facilitating shared decision-making is very important. We have to foster safety and trust, enhancing a survivor's physical and psychological safety, and apply professional demeanor that builds trust. Finally, the New Haven cross-cutting competency speaks directly to our professional duty, and this might be the most validating part for us as a clinician. The standard explicitly names practitioners' self-awareness and self-care are not just as a good ideal, but as a foundational competency. Treating complex PTSD takes a massive toll on our nervous system, and so we are absorbing intense affect, navigating dissociation, and holding space for the profound suffering. And so the competencies mandate that we must develop a high tolerance for this intense emotional content, but equally we have an ethical responsibility to monitor our own vicarious trauma. And our professional duty is not just do no harm, it is stay well enough to help. If we are burned out, we might unintentionally begin to employ avoidance strategies in the therapy room. We might steering client away from the heavy material because we simply don't have the bandwidth to hold it. So the true professional duty means doing our own consultation, managing our own nervous system, and recognizing that our well-being is the primary instrument we use to deliver effective trauma care. So the practitioner will recognize their own vulnerability, maintaining a capacity for self-reflection and ethically engaging in self-care to manage the intense effect of trauma work. Also, it is important to apply up-to-date science. We have to evaluate and apply the latest scientific research regarding the trauma therapies and assessment in our therapy room, and then working collaboratively with various professionals and paraprofessionals across different systems to enhance the positive outcome. So let's shift to broad core competencies, and these competencies focusing on specific functional domains of clinical trauma work. The first core competency is scientific knowledge about trauma. Practitioners must understand trauma's epidemiology, such as the prevalence, the risk factor, the trauma mechanisms, and the social, historical, and cultural context of trauma, as well as critically evaluate and communicate scientific findings. Psychological trauma focused assessment is also important. That clinicians must be willing to explicitly ask clients about lifetime trauma exposure. They must use comprehensive, validated assessment measures and be able to adjust their procedure to account for trauma-specific impacts like dissociation or avoidance. Trauma-focused psychosocial interventions involve skillfully applying research-supported psychosocial and pharmacological intervention. Clinicians must use phase treatment, tailor pacing to the client's needs, and foster a non-punitive and non-avoidant therapeutic relationship, and understand the mechanism of change. Broad core competencies also emphasize the relational and systems. Clinicians must understand how trauma disorganizes both individuals and institutions. They must be adept at interdisciplinary collaborations, recognizing how institutions can cause primary or secondary trauma, and use relational healing to address trauma-related injuries. So the New Haven competencies provide a broad educational and ethical blueprints for how trauma should be treated generally. Our EMDR adaptation for complex PTSD provides specific clinical instructions for doing exactly that. So across these 5 Go With Them magazine articles and the 2 articles from Dr. Korn, we've looked at a lot of ground level clinical strategies. But when you step back and look at them all together, a clear theme emerged. The standard 8-phase EMDR protocol must be significantly adapted for survivors of chronic trauma. Now, having all these practical tools is great, but how does this overarching theme actually measure up against the gold standard of the trauma care? In the next few slides, I'm going to do a comparison of the New Haven standard versus our adapted protocol. So in complex trauma, EMDR experts agree that phase 1 must be treated as a foundational clinical phase, mapping out not just the abuse that happened, but the developmental neglect or what should happen but didn't happen. This directly fulfills the New Haven core competency of psychosocial trauma focused assessment. This competency mandates that clinicians should adjust their assessment procedures to account for the unique complexities and trajectories of trauma. By utilizing such as the 5 Ps to map out unmet needs, EMDR therapists are meeting the New Haven requirement to address complex person-environment interactions and long-term developmental impact. Before touching horrific traumatic memories, EMDR therapists must extend phases 2 to proactively build a client's affect toleration. So by using such as resource development installation to establish a big enough boat of the adaptive information, the therapist safely stabilize the clients. And this perfectly aligns with New Haven standard mandating the use of phased treatment. The New Haven framework explicitly states that clinicians must not rush into exposure, but instead we use a phased approach that matches the survivor's evolving needs, and then also actively assess and incorporating the client's pre-existing strengths, resilience, and potential for growth. Standard EMDR often will teach clinicians to target the first and worst memories, but with complex trauma, this can set the client up for failure.
So instead, therapists can use symptom focus or bottom-up targeting, working at the edge of what is tolerable. And this embodies the New Haven cross-cutting competency of fostering safety and trust. By avoiding overwhelming targets, the clinician can uphold the ethical mandate to prioritize the survivor's psychological safety and prevent treatment-induced or harm the clients. And it also fulfill the requirement to tailor interventions specifically to a client's unique vulnerabilities. Complex trauma forces the nervous system to fragment into protective parts and will causing profound somatic or somatoform dissociation. And adapted EMDR requires therapists to actively map these self states and gradually restore bodily awareness before the processing. Then you have a framework also directly accounts for this challenge, stating that practitioners must recognize the disorganizing effect of trauma, and these competencies explicitly require clinicians to adjust their procedures to account for unique trauma-specific presentations, and specifically naming the dissociation, avoidance, and emotional triggers. Finally, in complex trauma, the EMDR therapist cannot be a passive observer. They must act as an active co-regulator using micro-titration, cognitive interweaves, and a structural relational repair to override the client's historical expectations of abandonment. This is the very definition of the New Haven core competence of trauma-informed relational and systems practice. New Haven stressed the absolute necessity of using relational healing for relational injuries. By guiding a client safely across the bridge from a past wound into present day safety, the EMDR clinicians utilize the therapeutic relationship itself to foster trust and deep, lasting healing. Ultimately, when you look at these EMDR adaptations through a lens of the New Haven competencies, it becomes clear. Treating complex trauma safely requires moving beyond rigid exposure models. It requires a flexible, phased, and deeply relational approach, one that honors the resilience of the survivor and the true complexities of their healing journey.
Okay, this is it. My big project of talking about using EMDR, working with complex PTSD, the adaptation that needed. Um, I start by summarizing the 5 articles from the Go With That magazine in the part 1. Those are fantastic articles. If you haven't read it, you really should go read it. I wasn't able to spend enough time in each article. There are so many rich informations in there that you should go read it on your own. And then the 2 articles from Dr. Deborah Korn about resource development installation, that working with the chronic complex PTSD with clients who suffer from severe and chronic trauma. And then I also summarize the common theme that based on my understanding and what I see. And then I summarize the New Haven trauma standard. That is the article I come across from a while ago, and that has been guiding me doing the trauma work. And then I try to compare all this adaptation, the EMDR from the EMDR standard protocol, and see how they stack up with the New Haven competency. So at the beginning of this video, I talked about the shared frustration that I often see in the EMDR consultation groups. And that's a reality. That is, the standard protocol doesn't always capture what our complex trauma client need. So if there's one thing looking at the Go With The magazine articles and the Dr. Korn's literature and the New Haven standard showing us that is that you aren't doing it wrong. Treating complex PTSD is incredibly heavy, nuanced work. It requires us to be rigorously informed and deeply flexible in the room. The fact that you are taking the time to engage with this material shows just how dedicated you are to your clients. So thank you for watching this video. Head down to the comments and let's build a resource together. Same question. What is the biggest difficulty you face when using EMDR with complex trauma? And what is the specific adaptation that you have found that's most helpful? Okay, thank you for watching this video. If you found this deep dive helpful, please like and subscribe so we can keep having these conversations. And take care of yourself and keep up with the great work that you are doing out there. See you next time.